Prisons are hotbeds of terrorism, and we must do more to stop it. If you don't believe me, let's just look at the latest terrorist, Khalid Massoud, who perpetrated the London terrorist attacks. He shows the perfect path of someone with a traumatized childhood who then ends up in prison, gets radicalized in prison, and then comes out and becomes a terrorist. He follows the jihadist twisted path from prison to terrorist. Khalid Massoud was born in the UK on Christmas Day 52 years ago. He was born to an unwed, white, 17-year-old mother. Now, obviously, he had strikes against him when he was born, and particularly since this was in the 60s, where there was a lot of racism and a lot of prejudice against unwed teen mothers. She eventually got married 2 years later to a Nigerian man, and Khalid went to a middle-class school where he did well, he was considered to be intelligent, and he was a good athlete. And the photographs of him at that school are amazing. You know, to look at those photographs where he looks like he is doing well in school, and then to know that years later he became a terrorist who terrified London. It's just shocking, and it makes you wonder what happened to this guy who looked like this, who looked well-adjusted in school. Now, of course, looks can be deceiving, and in fact, he was a very angry child who resented the fact that he was an outcast because of the circumstances of his birth and his childhood. And after he got out of school, his life began to fall apart. He got into drugs, he got into debt, and he got into crime. And one of his earliest crimes was that in which he used a knife, which of course was a forerunner of the crime that he perpetrated, the terrorist attack in London, in which he used a knife to attack a guard. So after, of course, as he committed these crimes, he began being incarcerated. And as he was incarcerated, he became a perfect target of terrorists, people who were incarcerated for terrorist-related crimes, and they saw him as a perfect target, as someone who they could radicalize, because they saw his simmering anger and resentment, his anger against society, and they knew that they could capitalize on it by converting him to Islam, but not just to Islam, but to radical Islam, and to send him on the path to becoming a terrorist, which they obviously did. Now, ex-cons, when he followed also the path of a typical ex-con who has been radicalized in prison. These people traveled to Islamist hotspots in the Middle East, and Khalid traveled to Saudi Arabia, and he worked there for several years and got more indoctrinated. He then moved back to the UK, to a city not far from London, which actually is considered a hotbed of Islamist terrorists. So he continued his indoctrination, his radicalization, until finally he did commit this terrorist attack. Now, there was a study in 2010 by the New York State Police Vigilance Report, and they found that about 50% of the people who went on to commit terrorist attacks have a history of having been incarcerated. So what does this tell you? It tells you that amongst our counterterrorism efforts, we need to concentrate a lot more of them in prisons, because that is a controlled environment where we can have a lot more impact on these wannabe terrorists. These people who have come into prison, typically in general, unrelated to terrorism, typically people in general who become incarcerated have had troubled childhoods, severely troubled childhoods. And when they then become victims of people in prison, terrorists in prison, who want to radicalize them, it sets them on a course after prison to commit these terrorist attacks. So here are 6 things that we can do to stop it. One, first of all, radical literature in prisons must be removed. You might be surprised to hear, as I was, that there are radical publications in prison, like the ISIS magazine, Inspire, and like literature from the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and so on. Now, I know what you're thinking. People in prison should have access to all kinds of literature, but literature that is propaganda to turn them into terrorists, I think, should be banned. Now, I'm not talking about the Quran. Of course, the Quran should be allowed in prison, but it's the terrorists who then pervert what is said in the Quran, to twist it for their own ends, to make it something that then provokes people to commit terrorist attacks. There needs to be better observation of inmate interactions, that's number 2, so that there's less bullying going on and less influence of these terrorists to the non-terrorist prisoners. There needs to be, the de-radicalization programs need to be more effective. They need to look at the childhood of these prisoners, not just to look at the most recent kinds of events. That's 3. 4, the clergy must be better vetted, and that includes the chaplains who are sort of at a loss to know what to do with these prisoners who are being radicalized, and even the Islamic clergy. There needs to be better vetting to separate out the ones who are simply teaching the Quran and those who are twisting the Quran in an effort to turn these prisoners into terrorists. 5, there needs to be better surveillance of inmate telephone calls and mail. As a psychiatric expert witness, I have a lot of contacts with prisoners, both going into the prisons to evaluate them and then having further contact in telephone calls and mail. And it is a very strange, sort of uncomfortable feeling knowing that when you're talking to these prisoners, that your telephone calls and that your mail is being looked at. Of course, apparently not enough of it or not all of it is looked at, or else we could stop some terrorist attacks. There needs to be, number 6, and this would be just like an important way of controlling what happens, because Khalid, for example, fell off the radar and after he got out of prison, and even off the radar when he was in this town that he moved to before he committed the attack. But there needs to be a registry of inmates upon their release, and this registry needs to be monitored, just like there are sex offender registries. And these people need to have to come to register wherever they move, and they need to be monitored much more closely. So, if we do these 6 things, which really are not that difficult, especially since it's a controlled environment, we can stop about 50% at least now of the people who became radicalized in prison from becoming terrorists and perpetrating attacks like the one that just happened in London.